The plate hit the table with a sound like a gunshot. Alice Townsend stared at it, the seventh plate in 7 days, and something inside her chest cracked open like drought-split earth. She had told him. She had told him on the very first morning, standing in his doorway with her carpetbag still in her hand and dust from the Cimarron Trail still on her boots, that she was only passing through. She had said those exact words. She was not staying. She was not looking for a home, not looking for a family, not looking for a man with quiet brown eyes and calloused hands who set an extra plate without ever once being asked. And yet here it was again. Blue-rimmed ceramic. A fork aligned with military precision beside it. A tin cup of water placed exactly where a person's hand would naturally reach. She turned to look at Aaron Donovan across the kitchen, and the thing she saw in his face was worse than anger. It was patience. That devastatingly calm, infinite patience that she had never once in her 26 years encountered in any man, and it terrified her down to the marrow. "You did it again," she said, and her voice came out raw. He turned from the stove, a worn dish towel over his shoulder, and looked at her the way a man looks at something he is not sure he is allowed to want. "Supper's almost ready," he said. Simple, plain. Like setting a place for her was the most natural thing in the world. "Aaron," her voice cracked on his name. "I told you I'm leaving." "You told me that yesterday too," he said, and there was no accusation in it, no manipulation, just fact offered gently like water. "And the day before," she said. "Yes." "So why do you keep—" She gestured at the plate and felt the words dissolve before she could form them, because the real question was not why he kept setting the plate. The real question was why she kept sitting down at it. Why for 7 mornings in a row she had woken in the small, clean room he'd given her, told herself this was the day she would go, and then found herself at that table with a cup of coffee and the sound of Aaron Donovan moving quietly around his kitchen, and felt, for the first time in 3 years, like she could breathe. She was terrified of that feeling, because the last time she had let herself breathe, everything had burned. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. To understand why Alice Townsend was standing in a kitchen in Harlow Creek, New Mexico territory, in the autumn of 1883, trembling at the sight of a dinner plate, you have to go back to the beginning. You have to go back to the night she arrived. She had not planned to stop in Harlow Creek at all. The town was not on any map she'd carried out of St. Louis. It was barely a town, a main street of maybe 9 buildings, a general store, a livery, a small sheriff's office with a tilted star nailed above the door, and a saloon that doubled as a post office on Tuesdays. She had been on the southbound stage from Santa Fe, heading for El Paso, where she'd been told there was work for a woman who could keep books and ask no questions. El Paso had seemed, if not hopeful, at least sufficiently far from everything she was running from. But the stage had thrown a wheel 4 miles outside of Harlow Creek, and by the time the driver had managed to limp it into town, it was past 10 in the evening and the next stage south would not come for 2 days. There were 6 other passengers. A traveling salesman named Horace Birch, who immediately went to the saloon and did not come out. A young couple recently married, who went to the hotel above the general store and were not seen again until morning. A minister with a gray beard and a large black Bible who slept in the stage office on a cot the driver provided, and an older woman named Mrs. Elda Purvis, who owned half of Harlow Creek and who looked Alice up and down with sharp, knowing eyes when she climbed off the stage and said, "You look like you've been running, girl." "I've been traveling," Alice said, which was true, but only in the way that a river running away from a flood might call itself traveling. Mrs. Purvis had taken Alice to the small boarding house she kept on the north end of town, fed her cold biscuits and honey, and told her she could stay for $2 a week as long as she needed. Alice said she would only need 2 nights. It was Mrs. Purvis who had mentioned Aaron Donovan the next morning, when Alice came down for breakfast and found her neighbor's boy at the door asking Mrs. Purvis if she'd brought back any pepper from her trip to Santa Fe. "That's young Tommy Kessler," Mrs. Purvis said, watching Alice watch the boy run back down the lane. "His family lives down by the creek. Nice people. Most people here are decent. She refilled Alice's coffee. Decency is not something to be taken lightly out here. You'll find more of it in a town this size than you will in a city. I'm sure that's true, Alice said politely, not meaning it, not believing in decency anymore in any particular geography. Aaron Donovan's the most decent man I've ever known, Mrs. Purvis continued, as if speaking to herself. Runs the horse operation 3 miles east, breeds and trains quarter horses. Lost his wife 4 years ago, fever, and just kept going. Never complains. Brings me a cord of wood every October without being asked. Sets a fair price and doesn't haggle widows. She looked at Alice. Why are you in such a hurry to leave, girl? Alice wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. I have business in El Paso. What kind of business? Work. Mrs. Purvis made a sound that was not quite disbelief but was not acceptance either. What kind of work can a young woman find in El Paso that she couldn't find somewhere quieter? Alice did not answer, because the honest answer was that she was not going to El Paso for work at all. She was going to El Paso because it was as far south as she could get on what little money remained in her purse, and because she needed distance. Miles and miles of irreversible distance between herself and the life she had left behind in Kansas City. She had been a bookkeeper there for a man named Gerald Forsyth, who owned a dry goods empire that stretched across 4 counties and who had, over the 2 years Alice worked for him, slowly and methodically dismantled her judgment, isolated her from her friends, convinced her that she could not trust her own mind. And then, when she had finally gathered the shattered pieces of her courage and left, spread word across Kansas City that she had stolen from his accounts. It was a lie so efficiently constructed that it had nearly cost her everything: her reputation, her chance of references, her freedom briefly, when a sheriff's deputy had come to her rooming house with a warrant that was eventually dismissed for lack of evidence, because there was no evidence, because she had done nothing wrong. But being innocent does not remove the stain that men like Gerald Forsyth can spread over a woman's name. And so she had gone, first to Wichita, then to Albuquerque, then Santa Fe, now on the stage to El Paso, or so she'd planned. She did not plan what happened on the afternoon of her second day in Harlow Creek. She was walking along the main street, not particularly going anywhere, when the horse came loose. It happened in front of the livery, a big bay stallion, maybe 16 hands, young and green-broke and clearly spooked by something, pulling free of a hitching post with the kind of terrified energy that sends bystanders running. The horse wheeled into the street, and the salesman Horace Birch, who happened to be standing directly in its path, nursing a midday whiskey from the saloon doorway, stumbled backward into a crate of empty bottles that shattered and sent him sprawling. 2 women gathered their skirts and pressed against the general store wall. A dog fled under the boardwalk. The horse, now panicking in earnest, turned again toward the middle of the street, eyes white and wild. Alice had grown up on her uncle's horse farm in southern Indiana before her uncle's death had sent her to the city. She had spent her childhood around horses. She did not think. She simply stepped into the street, positioned herself not directly in front of the animal but slightly to the side, and began to talk. Not loud, not commanding, just a low, steady, unhurried sound. A stream of words that were not really words so much as tone, rhythm, continuity. She moved 1 slow step closer. Then another. The horse's ears swiveled, its circling slowed. She reached out a hand and let the horse come to her instead of going to it, and within 2 minutes she had her fingers on the lead rope and the crisis was over. She was standing there, patting the horse's neck and feeling the animal's heart rate slow under her palm, when a man came out of the livery at a near run and stopped dead when he saw her. He was perhaps 30, 32, broad through the shoulders, dark hair that needed cutting, a jaw that had not seen a razor in 2 or 3 days. He wore a plain work shirt with the sleeves rolled and a pair of heavy canvas trousers with dirt on the knees, and he looked at her, at Alice holding his runaway horse in the middle of the main street of Harlow Creek, with an expression she could not quite read. Not gratitude yet, something closer to stunned. "That's my horse," he said. "I know," she said. "He knows now too." The man walked forward slowly the way she had and took the lead rope from her. He ran a hand down the horse's face, checking its eyes, its legs, murmuring something so quiet she could not hear it. Then he straightened and looked at her again. "Aaron Donovan," he said, and held out his free hand. "Alice Townsend." She shook it. His grip was firm without being a test. "You know horses," he said. "I used to." He studied her for a moment, and she expected the next thing to be some kind of compliment framed as a question, a man trying to figure out how to be charming about something she'd done. Instead he said, "I was about to take him back to the ranch. He gets like this when something startles him in an enclosed space. I've been working on it." He paused. "If you have a moment and you know horses the way you clearly do, I wouldn't mind a second set of hands." It was the most practical invitation she had ever received. No flattery, no performance. Just a straightforward offer that treated her as competent, which was so disorienting that she said yes before she had fully decided to. She went to his ranch. It was 3 miles east on a good road that turned to a track, and then to a path that wound through low juniper and scrubby pinyon pine, before opening up into a flat, grassy spread with a solid adobe house, a well-built barn, 3 corrals, and a view of the Sandia Mountains to the east that made Alice catch her breath in spite of herself. The mountains were the color of old copper in the afternoon light, and the sky above them was the particular deep blue that only exists at altitude, and she stood at the entrance to his property for a moment just looking. "Good country," she said. "Best I've ever seen," he agreed, which was not a boast. Just the plain truth of a man who had looked hard at the land he'd chosen and found it sufficient. He had a hand, a young Navajo man named Tomás who lived in a small house at the edge of the property, and who acknowledged Alice with a brief nod that carried no particular warmth but no hostility either. They worked with the bay horse for the rest of the afternoon, the 3 of them moving through a series of careful, methodical exercises that Aaron had clearly been developing over time. He knew what he was doing with horses. He was patient, consistent. He did not lose his temper when the horse spooked again, just reset and started over with the same quiet authority. Alice found herself slipping into the work without thinking, adding small things, a different angle of approach, a particular way of introducing a strange object slowly rather than quickly. And Aaron watched what she did and adjusted his own technique accordingly, without ego, without resistance. He was, she thought, one of the most teachable people she had ever worked beside. Most men were not teachable. Most men decided what they knew and defended it. By the time the sun was getting low, the bay horse was standing calmly while a burlap sack was waved near its head, which was significant progress for an afternoon. Aaron led the horse into the barn and settled it, and when he came back out he said, "I'd offer you supper, but you probably need to get back to town before dark." She had not thought about getting back to town. She had not thought about anything for the past 3 hours except the horse and the work, which was the longest she had gone without thinking about Gerald Forsyth or the warrant or what came next in longer than she could remember. "The stage doesn't come until tomorrow afternoon," she said, which was not quite an answer. He looked at her. "You can eat then. I won't make it complicated." He did not make it complicated. He made beans and cornbread and sliced some cold roast from a pan on the shelf, and they ate at a small table in his kitchen by lamplight while the night wind came up outside and moved through the junipers. He did not pepper her with questions. He talked about the horse. He talked about the quarter horse breed and what he was trying to develop in his line speed, yes, but also temperament, because a horse no one could safely ride was worthless no matter how fast it ran. He asked her occasionally what her uncle had done differently and listened carefully when she answered. It was the most she had spoken about her uncle's farm in years. She had not realized how much she missed it, the simplicity of it. The early mornings with dew on the grass and horses breathing steam in the cold. The way work with animals asked nothing of you except presence and honesty. She was honest with horses. She had forgotten how to be honest with people. When he drove her back to Mrs. Purvis's boarding house in his buckboard, the stars were enormous above the desert, blazing in a way she had never seen in any city, and she sat beside him in silence that was not uncomfortable, just quiet, like the end of a day that had been full. "Thank you for the help today," he said when he stopped in front of Mrs. Purvis's. "Thank you for the supper," she said. She climbed down from the buckboard. She was about to say good night, and she was absolutely going to mean it, because her stage was tomorrow and she was leaving, when he said, "If you have time in the morning and you wanted to see how the bay does overnight, Tamaz comes in at first light, but an extra hand wouldn't go wrong." She told herself she would not go. She lay in Mrs. Purvis's spare room and told herself firmly and clearly that she would not go back to that ranch, because there was nothing there for her, and she had a stage to catch and a life to keep moving away from. She went back to the ranch in the morning. The stage came and went without her. She was in the corral with the bay horse and did not even hear the wheels on the main street. Aaron did not mention it when she was there all day and then ate supper at his table again. He simply set 2 plates. When the light went and she looked up and realized she had missed it, he said only, "Mrs. Purvis has the room." "I need to go tomorrow," she said. "All right," he said. She did not go tomorrow. She went out the next morning and worked with the horses all day and ate at his table and went back to Mrs. Purvis's and told herself she would go the day after. By the 5th day, even Mrs. Purvis had stopped asking. By the 7th day, Aaron Donovan was setting an extra plate before she arrived, which is to say he was setting it in the confidence, not the demand, not the expectation, but the quiet faith that she would come. And she did come. And she stood in his kitchen and looked at that plate and felt the crack open in her chest and said, "You did it again," with a rawness she had not intended. "Supper's almost ready," he said. "Aaron," her voice cracked. "I told you I'm leaving. You told me that yesterday, too." She stood there for a long moment, the plate between them like evidence of something. Then she sat down at the table. She did not know why she sat down. Or perhaps she did know, and the knowing was what terrified her. He brought the food over. He sat across from her. He poured the coffee. And after a moment he said, without looking at her, "You don't have to tell me anything, but I want you to know that whatever made you run, it doesn't matter here. Not to me." She looked up. He was looking at the table. His face was tired in a way that was not tonight's tiredness but years of it, the specific exhaustion of a man who has kept going after something essential was taken from him. "Your wife," she said before she could stop herself. He looked up then. His eyes were very steady. "Rebecca," he said, "typhoid fever, summer of '79. "I'm sorry. Thank you." He picked up his fork. "She would have liked you. She had no patience for nonsense either." Alice felt something loosen in her throat. "How do you know I have no patience for nonsense?" "Because you've been here 7 days and you haven't talked to me about the weather once." She laughed. It came out of her suddenly, without permission, and it was the first real laugh she had produced in so long that the sound surprised her. It surprised him too. She saw his face change, soften, the way a window looks when the light hits it from a different angle. "Alice," he said gently, "what are you running from?" She looked at him across the table with its 2 plates and its tin cups and its lamp burning low, and she made a decision that she did not entirely understand, which was to tell him the truth. She told him everything. About Kansas City, about Gerald Forsyth and the 2 years of working for him, and how slowly and skillfully he had dismantled her until she could barely recognize herself. About the way he had reframed every act of confidence she had as arrogance, every opinion she held as wrong-headedness, every time she pushed back as betrayal of his trust. About the warrant that had followed her. She told him about the dark past she carried like a stone in her pocket, not a past of wrongdoing, but a past of having been wronged so thoroughly that it had become indistinguishable from guilt in her own mind. Aaron listened. He did not interrupt. He did not offer opinions or advice while she was speaking. He just held still with the complete attention of a man who understood that some things need to be said into open air before they lose their power. When she finished, the food was mostly cold. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Forsyth is wrong about who you are, and you know that." "Most of the time," she said. "Enough of the time. I'm working on it." He nodded slowly. "The warrant's dismissed." "Yes, there's a letter from the judge in my bag." "Then legally you're clear." "Legally, yes, the rumors aren't legal. Rumors die," he said. "Give them enough miles and enough time." She looked at him. "Is that experience speaking?" He met her eyes. "When Rebecca died, people here, good people, well-meaning people, talked about whether I'd done enough, whether I'd gotten the doctor soon enough, whether I'd been too far out on the range when she first got sick. None of it was true. None of it mattered. A year later, nobody talked about it anymore. Because you stayed," she said. "You gave it time." "Yes." The word sat between them, and she understood that it was not a suggestion. He was not telling her to stay. He was telling her what had worked for him, which was different. But the silence that followed it had a shape that felt like possibility. She washed the dishes that night. He dried them. They did not touch. They stood 6 inches apart at the wash basin and handed dishes back and forth in the lamplight and talked about small things, where he'd gotten the adobe mortar mix right on the barn wall, whether the well needed clearing before winter, how the bay horse had eaten tonight. It was so ordinary it nearly broke her in two. She went back to Mrs. Purvis's. She lay in the dark. She pressed her hands against her sternum and felt the place where the crack was, and thought about Gerald Forsyth's voice saying, "You are not the kind of woman a decent man wants, Alice," and she thought about the plate, the 7th plate, set without pressure or demand or hidden motive, just faith, just "I think you will come back and I am ready." She thought, what if she stayed for another week, just to see? She did not tell herself it was anything more than that. She was not a fool. And she was not the kind of woman who confuses gratitude with love or need with desire. But she was also, she was beginning to admit, the kind of woman who could fall in love with a man who listened better than anyone she had ever met, who was patient with horses and with people for the same reason that he understood that fear could not be pushed through, only walked through, quietly, one day at a time. In the morning she went to Mrs. Purvis and said she would need the room another week. Mrs. Purvis said, "Of course you will," in a tone that suggested she had known this for some time. The second week was different from the first because something had shifted between them. The telling had changed things, not dramatically, not in any way that announced itself, but the way a room changes when someone opens a window. More air, more light, more of the real. Aaron asked for her help with the bookkeeping. He had a ledger of horse sales and purchases and feed costs that he kept in a workmanlike but imprecise way, and when he showed it to her, she could see immediately where his records were loose and where he was almost certainly losing track of money. She spent 2 afternoons reorganizing his system and teaching him how to cross-reference it, and the pleasure she took in the clean columns of numbers, in the clarity and order that a good ledger provided, reminded her that she was good at this. She was genuinely skilled at it. Gerald Forsyth had not hired her for nothing. He had hired her because she was exceptional, and then spent 2 years convincing her otherwise. "You're very good at this," Aaron said, watching her work. "I know," she said, and then blinked, because it was the first time in years she had agreed to a compliment without immediately softening it or deflecting it. He smiled. It was a slow, private smile, the kind that was not performed. "You look surprised that you said that." "I am slightly." "Get used to it," he said. "You're good at it, you should know that." She looked at him. The lamplight was on his face and he was perfectly sincere and not trying to win anything with the compliment, not softening her up for something else, just stating what he observed. The warmth that moved through her was not gratitude. She was honest enough to know it was not gratitude. She stayed a second week. The third week brought trouble, and not the kind Alice had been watching for. Tamaz came to the barn on a Monday morning with the news that 2 of Aaron's best horses, a breeding pair, a chestnut mare and a compact dun stallion, had been taken from the far paddock overnight. The paddock gate had been worked open with some kind of tool, not broken by accident. The tracks in the soft earth near the creek showed 3 horses heading southeast. Aaron's face went very still when Tamaz told him. Alice was there, helping sort tack, and she watched Aaron absorb the information with that stillness she was beginning to understand was not coldness but control, the practiced steadiness of a man who had learned that the first response to bad news should not be action but assessment. "How much did those two represent in your operation?" she asked quietly. 18 months of breeding work, he said. "The mares in foal, and about 60% of what I was planning to sell this spring." The material loss was significant. The loss of the foal hurt him in a different way, she could see it. "Do you know who?" she asked. "There's a man," Aaron said carefully, "named Cord Halsey. He runs a loose operation down near the border, buys horses without asking questions about where they came from." He looked at Tamaz. "You think it's Halsey's people? 2 of the 3 sets of tracks are wearing a distinctive shoe," Tamaz said. "Short and wide. I've seen that pattern in Halsey's corrals." Aaron nodded slowly. "I need to go to the sheriff." The sheriff of Harlow Creek was a man named Walt Briggs, 50 years old and deliberate in the way of a man, who had survived this long by not making hasty decisions. He listened to what Aaron told him and looked at the photographs of the tracks that Tamaz had made in a notebook with careful precision, and he said he would send word to the federal marshal's office in Santa Fe, because Halsey was known there and had outstanding warrants that were older and larger than a horse theft. It was not fast, but it was the right answer. Alice went back to the ranch with Aaron and spent the morning helping him take stock of what remained, calculate the financial impact, and write a careful accounting that the marshal would need. She worked until early afternoon, her pen moving steadily through figures, and when she looked up, Aaron was watching her from the barn doorway with an expression she had not seen before. "What?" she asked. "You just moved through a crisis like it was a bookkeeping problem to solve." "It is a bookkeeping problem to solve. The emotional part is real, but it doesn't help the horses come back. The documentation might." He was quiet for a moment. "Thank you," he said, "for being here for this." The sentence was simple, but the weight in it was considerable, because what he was really saying was thank you for not leaving before this happened, and they both understood that. Something was building between them, and they were both aware of it, and neither of them was in any hurry, which was its own form of luxury. Alice had spent 2 years being rushed by Gerald Forsyth, rushed into trust, rushed into dependence, rushed into a version of herself that served his purposes. The slowness of whatever was developing between her and Aaron was not timidity. It was respect. The deliberateness of 2 people who had both been wounded and were choosing not to wound each other. At the end of the 3rd week, she moved out of Mrs. Purvis's boarding house. She was very clear with herself and with Mrs. Purvis and with Aaron that she was not moving into his house. He had a small, solid outbuilding that had once been a second sleeping room when he'd had 2 ranch hands before Tamaz took over much of the work, and it was clean and had a window and a small iron stove, and Aaron cleared it out and put a good frame bed and a braided rug in it without drama or ceremony and said, "It's yours as long as you want it." "I'm still not sure how long I'm staying," she said. "That's fine," he said, and she believed him. That was the extraordinary thing. She believed him. She was 26 years old, and she was beginning, very carefully, to believe in a man again. October deepened in the Sandia Mountains. The cottonwoods along the creek went golden, and the mornings crackled with cold, and the horses grew heavy winter coats that made them look like different animals. Alice fell into the rhythm of the ranch in a way that felt less like falling and more like arriving, coming into alignment. She knew horses again, and she was good with them, and Aaron included her in the work without making it formal or declared, just allowed the partnership to exist the way a natural thing exists, without forcing it. They found their horses 2 weeks after the theft. The federal marshal's office had moved faster than anyone expected, largely because Cord Halsey had been the subject of a larger investigation involving stolen cattle as well as horses across 3 territories. And Alice's documentation had provided the kind of clear, organized evidence that the marshal's deputy said was the most useful thing he had received from a victim's side in several years. The horses were recovered from a holding pen 40 miles southeast of Harlow Creek, the chestnut mare safe and in good condition. Halsey and 2 of his associates were arrested and remanded to federal custody in Santa Fe. When Aaron brought the horses home, Tamaz met him at the gate, and there was a moment between the 2 men, brief, quiet, that Alice watched from a distance and understood contained years of shared difficulty and perseverance. Aaron was not a man given to visible celebration, but he stood in the corral with the mare's head in his hands and his forehead against hers for a long moment, just still, just grateful, and Alice felt something in her give way that she had been holding clenched for a very long time. She walked into the corral. He heard her and lifted his head. She did not say anything. She walked to the mare and put her own hand on the horse's neck and stood beside Aaron in the cold October air, and they were standing close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, and neither of them moved to change that. "I'm glad she's back," Alice said. "So am I," he said. Neither of them was only talking about the horse. He turned to look at her. She looked up at him. The sky over the mountains was that deep copper and blue again, the color she had seen the first afternoon she came here, and the wind moved through the dry grass outside the corral with a sound like pages turning. "Alice," he said. "Yes," she said before he had asked anything, which was perhaps the most revealing thing she had done since she arrived. He took a long breath. "I'm not going to press you for anything. I want to be very clear about that. What you've been through, Aaron," she stopped him gently. "What I've been through is in the past. It lives back there. Right now I'm here and I know the difference." He looked at her steadily. "Do you?" "Yes," she said with certainty that surprised her with its completeness. "He was a trap I didn't see. You're the opposite of a trap." A faint line deepened at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile yet. "What's the opposite of a trap?" "Open ground," she said. "Room to go if I need to." The smile came then, slow and real. "You have room to go." "I know," she paused. "I don't want to go." He reached out very carefully and tucked a strand of hair that the wind had blown across her face back behind her ear. The touch lasted only a second and was so tender that it cost Alice every wall she had left. "Then don't," he said. She reached up and put her hand over his where it had come to rest at the side of her face. She felt his breath change. "I'm not passing through," she said. "No," he agreed. "You're not." She kissed him then, or he kissed her, or they both did at once. It was impossible later to say who had moved first, and neither of them tried to assign it. What she knew was that it was unhurried and certain and tasted of cold autumn air and the future, and when they broke apart they were both smiling, and the mare behind them flicked an ear and went back to cropping the dry grass, utterly unimpressed. Winter came hard to the high desert that year. The cold came down from the mountains in early November with teeth in it, and by December there was ice on the creek each morning, and the horses needed extra feed, and both corrals needed their troughs broken twice a day to keep the water flowing. Alice had moved permanently from the outbuilding into the main house by then, not with ceremony, not with any formal announcement, just gradually and naturally, the way things shift when 2 people decide together that proximity is better than distance. She slept in his room. He was a careful man, and she was a cautious woman, and what developed between them was real and physical and entirely consensual, and so tender that she sometimes lay awake in the cold dark just to think about it, the fact that this existed, that a man could be this gentle. That intimacy did not have to feel like a negotiation. She wrote to no one about this. There was no one she was close enough to any more to write. She had lost her friendships in Kansas City the same way she had lost everything else there, slowly and then all at once, and the loneliness of that was something she had grown so accustomed to that she had stopped recognizing it as loneliness. It had just become the texture of her life. But one evening in December she found herself writing to her mother's sister, Aunt Margaret, who lived in Cincinnati and who had sent Alice letters she had not answered for 2 years, and she wrote, "I am in New Mexico territory. I am staying somewhere for the winter. I have met someone. I think he is good. I think I may be happy," which is a strange thing to write. She folded the letter and addressed it and set it to send with the Tuesday stage. She felt lighter afterward, which told her that carrying the silence had been heavier than she'd realized. Aaron found her at the table with the letter in front of her. He didn't ask. She told him, because she had made a policy of telling him things. It was the most revolutionary habit she had ever acquired, saying the thing out loud instead of holding it behind her teeth. "I wrote to my aunt," she said. "I told her I was staying for winter." He sat down across from her. "Just winter?" he asked. No pressure, just curiosity. His brown eyes steady and warm in the lamplight. She looked at him. "I told her I'd met someone I thought was good." "Who'd you have in mind?" he asked, and the quiet humor in it made her laugh. "I haven't decided," she said. "There's a man at the livery who looked at me very admiringly last Tuesday. Bill Crane's 63 and has no teeth. He has kind eyes." Aaron reached across the table and took her hand. "Alice Townsend," he said. "I love you." She had known it was coming. She had felt it building like weather on the mountains. She had known her own feelings with increasing clarity for weeks. And still the words hit her in the chest like something she had forgotten was real, like the first warm day after a brutal winter. So sharp it almost hurts. "I love you," she said back, and the words were not complicated or qualified. They were just true. He brought her hand to his mouth and kissed her knuckles, his eyes on her face, and she thought, this is what it is supposed to feel like. This is what I did not know I was waiting for. Not saving, not being swept up, not someone deciding to love her as a project. Just two people who had each lost things, choosing each other with full information and clear eyes. She stayed for winter. She stayed through the spring. In March, the chestnut mare foaled a big colt, liver chestnut like his mother, with a white blaze and 4 white stockings. And he came out into the world loud and determined, and was on his feet within an hour, nursing with such forceful enthusiasm that the mare looked mildly offended. Aaron and Alice were both there for it, the birth happening in the middle of the night, the two of them in the lantern-lit barn with the smell of straw and horses and cold air around them. And when the colt staggered upright for the first time, Alice grabbed Aaron's arm without thinking, and he covered her hand with his and they watched together. And it was one of the best moments of her life. "Name him," Aaron said. "Me. He wouldn't be here if you hadn't held that warrant together and gotten the documentation right. Halsey would have sold his mother before she foaled." Alice looked at the colt. He was nosing at the mare, impatient and curious, and already expressing a strong opinion about the world. "Persistence," she said. Aaron laughed softly. "That's a heavy name for a horse. He looks like a heavy-named horse to me." They called him Persist for short, and he grew to be one of the finest horses Aaron ever produced. April brought a visitor. Alice was coming up from the creek with a bucket of water when she saw a man on a gray horse stop at the entrance to the property and look at the sign. Aaron had put up DONOVAN quarter horses breeding and training, and then ride slowly up the track toward the house. He was middle-aged, in good clothes for a rancher, with the particular careful look of a man who is used to making assessments. Aaron came out of the barn when the man rode up. "Aaron Donovan," the man said. "That's right. My name is Harold Kershaw. I run the Kershaw spread up near Taos. I've been hearing about your quarter horses from 3 different people, and I'd like to talk business." It was the beginning of what would become a significant partnership, for Aaron Kershaw had money and connections, and was interested in purchasing several horses, and potentially commissioning a breeding contract for quality quarter horses for his operation. He stayed for 2 days, negotiating with Aaron at the kitchen table, while Alice sat at the end going over figures and contracts with a clarity and precision that Kershaw noticed by the end of the first evening. "Your wife does your contracts?" he asked Aaron. Aaron glanced at Alice. Alice looked at Kershaw. "I manage the business side of the operation," she said simply, without correcting the assumption, which was, she realized later, the first time she had not corrected it. Kershaw left with a contract for 3 horses and a handshake agreement to discuss future business in the fall. When he was gone, Aaron sat across from her at the cleared kitchen table and said, "You didn't correct him." "No," she said. He was very still for a moment. Then he said, with the direct simplicity that was one of his most fundamental qualities, "Alice Townsend, I would like very much to ask you to marry me." She looked at him. Her heart was not pounding. She was not giddy or scattered. She was simply entirely sure. "Ask then," she said. "Will you marry me?" He was looking at her straight on, no artifice, no performance, no hidden motive or forced choice. Just a man asking a woman clearly and without condition. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." He smiled, that full, unhurried smile that she had been watching emerge more and more frequently over the months, the one that had been held under ice by 4 years of grief, and had found its way back to the surface in her company. And she thought that was perhaps the thing she was most proud of in her life so far. They were married in June of 1884 at the small church in Harlow Creek, which was really just the schoolhouse with the schoolteacher's cross hung above the chalkboard on Sunday mornings, and which was perfectly adequate. Mrs. Purvis stood up with Alice, and Tamaz stood up with Aaron, which surprised the more traditional residents of Harlow Creek and did not surprise Alice or Aaron in the slightest, because Tamaz was the closest thing Aaron had to family, and that was simply the truth of it. Alice wore the dress she had been working on since April, a cream-colored cotton with a small collar and pearl buttons down the front that Mrs. Purvis had helped her sew by lantern light on 6 separate evenings. She carried sage from the hillside behind the ranch, tied with a ribbon her Aunt Margaret had sent along with a letter full of joy and relief that had made Alice cry twice. Aaron wore his best coat, which was navy wool and fit him well, and he had shaved that morning so the angle of his jaw was clean and strong, and when she walked up the aisle toward him, there were maybe 40 people in the schoolhouse church, everyone in Harlow Creek who could attend. He looked at her as if she were something he had not entirely dared to believe in yet, even now, even while she was walking toward him. She walked up and stood in front of him and said quietly before the minister began, "I'm not passing through any more." And he said, "I know," and took her hand. The minister married them in the traditional manner, and when they were pronounced husband and wife, Aaron kissed her with a gentle thoroughness that made 2 of the older women in the front row dab their eyes, and Horace Birch, the salesman, who had happened to be in Harlow Creek on a selling trip again, and had been invited because he had been there for the beginning, clapped enthusiastically from the back. They had a wedding supper at Mrs. Purvis's, who had apparently been planning it for some time, and there was more food than 40 people could consume, and several of the ranch families had brought instruments, and there was dancing in the yard under the June stars. And Alice danced with Aaron in the warm evening air and rested her head against his chest and felt the solidity of him, the realness of him, and thought, "I almost got on the stage. I almost kept going. I almost missed all of this." The forbidden future she had never thought she was allowed to have was right here, under her hands. The first year of their marriage was the happiest Alice Townsend, Alice Donovan. Now, though she kept both names for bookkeeping purposes because she had built a small reputation for clarity and precision that was worth maintaining, had ever spent. The ranch grew. Kershaw's recommendation brought 2 more clients in the fall and a third before Christmas. Alice organized the business side of things with a rigor and elegance that freed Aaron to focus entirely on the horses, which was where his genius lived, and between them, they made something that was better than either of them would have made alone. Tamaz expanded his own small house that winter with Aaron's help, and in the spring, Aaron introduced Alice to the fact that Tamaz had a sister, a young Navajo woman named Dolly, who was looking for work and was reliable and skilled with horses. Alice hired her immediately and without hesitation, and Dolly became an essential part of the ranch operation. The 4 of them made an unusual team by the standards of 1884 New Mexico, but unusualness had stopped concerning Alice some time ago. She was pregnant by that first winter, which she discovered on a cold December morning, and spent a full day turning over in her mind before she told Aaron that evening. She had not been certain how she felt about it. She knew she wanted children, had always thought she would want them, but the wanting had been abstract before. Now it was very immediate and slightly terrifying, and also, underneath the terror, luminously joyful. She told him at supper, direct as always now because she had no more use for circling. "I think I'm carrying," she said. He went very still in the way he did when something mattered enormously. Then he set down his fork and looked at her with an expression that held so much joy and fear and tenderness and the ghost of grief for a different pregnancy that had never happened, a child Rebecca had hoped for and never gotten to keep. She had learned, a loss that belonged to his hidden history, and that she had sat with him for one evening while he told her quietly in the dark. "Are you certain?" he asked. "Not entirely, but I think so." He reached across the table and took both her hands in his. His hands were warm and roughened and entirely familiar to her now. "How do you feel?" he asked, which was the exact right question. "Frightened," she said honestly, "and very happy." "Those can be the same thing," he said. "They've been the same thing with you since the beginning," she said, and he smiled and brought her hands to his lips. Their son was born in August of 1885, a hot, fierce arrival after a long labor that Alice endured with the same focused determination she brought to everything, with Mrs. Purvis and the town's midwife, a sensible woman named Clara Holt, attending. Aaron waited in the kitchen and drank 6 cups of coffee and wore a track in the floor, and then heard the infant cry and went still as stone. And when Mrs. Purvis came out and told him he could come in, he walked into the bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed beside Alice, who was tired down to her bones and completely radiant, and she put their son into his arms. The boy was substantial and dark-haired and loud, and he blinked at his father with eyes that would settle into the same steady brown as Aaron's, and Aaron sat there holding his son with tears running freely down his face and not the slightest inclination to stop them. "What do we call him?" Alice asked. Aaron looked up. His face was open in a way she had never seen from any man, unguarded, unashamed, full. "Henry," he said. "If that suits you, it was my father's name." "Henry," she said, trying it. "Henry Donovan, that suits him." Henry Donovan proved to be a substantial and opinionated person from his first hours. He ate enthusiastically, slept selectively, and had a great deal to communicate that he was frustrated the adults could not yet understand. He grew fast and was sitting up by 4 months and pulling himself along the floor before 7 months, and was not yet a year old when he discovered the horses were visible from the kitchen window and became impossible to distract from the fact. "He takes after his mother," Aaron said, watching Henry drag himself purposefully toward the window. "He takes after both of us," Alice said. "We're both impossible to distract." 1886 passed in a fullness that Alice sometimes had to stop and acknowledge, because she had not known life could feel this substantial. The ranch had 5 full breeding pairs now, and a waiting list for trained horses that extended 8 months out. She had organized a proper accounting system, and had begun, quietly, to do bookkeeping for 2 other businesses in Harlow Creek, whose owners had heard that the Donovan woman had an extraordinary head for numbers. The sheriff, Walt Briggs, asked her to look over the town's accounts one afternoon, and found a discrepancy he had been puzzling over for 6 months resolved inside of 40 minutes. "You should have an office," Aaron said. "I have a table," she said. "You should have a proper office. We have room." They built an addition to the house that fall, a small room with a window looking east toward the mountains, which she had said from early on was the best view she had ever seen, and which she wanted to look at every day. Aaron built her a proper desk of pine and walnut, and Tamaz made her a bookshelf, and the room became hers entirely, ordered and quiet and hers, and she sat in it the first morning after it was finished and looked at the mountains and the clean surfaces and the waiting ledgers, and felt a satisfaction so complete it was almost solemn. This was who she was, who she had always been, underneath what Forsyth had tried to bury. A woman who could organize the world and who deserved a window with a good view. She thought about Forsyth rarely now. He had become something that existed a long way back in a different life, real but not present. He had not managed to follow her here, not even in memory most days. What he had tried to take, she had rebuilt, better and stronger than before, in the same way a bone heals stronger at a break. The warrant and the false accusation remained part of her history. She did not hide it. Several of Harlow Creek's residents knew the broad outline because she had not dissembled when questions came. She had learned that secrets fester and the truth is just easier to live with, and not one of them in this town had used it against her. Decency was not something to be taken lightly, Mrs. Purvis had told her. She had been right. Elda Purvis became, over those years, something very close to family. She joined them for Sunday suppers with the regularity of habit and the comfort of belonging, and she adored Henry with a fierce, practical affection that involved a great deal of actual horse play in the yard and not much sentimentality, which Henry appeared to prefer. Dolly running waiter Tamaz's sister turned out to be extraordinary with the training work, and by 1887 was doing most of the early groundwork with the young horses, freeing Aaron to focus on the later training and Alice to focus on the business side. She was also, quietly, becoming something of a friend to Alice, which was slower in developing because Dolly was private and had reasons to be careful with trust that were just as substantial as Alice's own. But there was, between them, a recognition. Two women who had been looked at as less than they were. Two women who were more than any estimation. In the spring of 1887, Alice's Aunt Margaret came to visit. She was 60 years old and had never been further west than Ohio, and she arrived on the stage with 3 large trunks and the expression of a woman prepared to be horrified by everything and privately thrilled by all of it. She was round and practical and warmly funny, and she took one look at Aaron and Henry and the ranch and the mountains and said to Alice privately, "You were right in that letter. He is good. And you are happy. I can tell the real kind." Alice hugged her aunt and breathed in the familiar scent of lavender she had known since childhood and felt the past and the present sit peacefully together. Margaret stayed for 3 weeks and attempted to teach Aaron to play cribbage, in which she failed, and attempted to bake a pie at altitude without adjusting the recipe, which she also failed, and was dragged through the corral mud by an enthusiastic 18-month-old Henry 4 times, which she did not regard as failure at all but a highlight of her visit. When she left, she took with her the absolute conviction that her niece had found the real thing, and told the stage driver so. He was politely uninterested. 1888 brought the second pregnancy, which Alice had been expecting and was entirely ready for. The morning sickness was worse this time, and she was 31 now and felt it more in her bones, but she remained herself throughout, still at her desk, still managing the accounts, still at the corral most mornings, just with slightly more careful attention to not overtiring. Aaron was different this second time around. Less frightened. He knew more of what was coming, knew how to be useful, knew when to be near and when to leave her alone, which was one of the most valuable things a person could know. He brought her ginger from the general store for the morning sickness and did not make a production of it. He took Henry for the mornings when she needed quiet. He read to her in the evenings from a volume of essays she'd ordered from a bookseller in Santa Fe, choosing pieces he thought she'd find interesting, which was itself interesting, that he had learned enough about what interested her to choose well. She thought about the plate again sometimes. The 7th plate, the thing that had cracked her open. She was standing in a kitchen now that she had half organized, at a table she had half chosen, in a house she had wholly made her home, and there was no plate set tonight because she lived here, and the question of plates had resolved itself in the most complete way possible. But she remembered how she had felt that evening. The terror of being known, the paralysis of someone's quiet faith in her when she had stopped believing she deserved it. She was glad, every single day, that she had sat down. Their second child was born in November of 1888, another boy, smaller than Henry had been but no less determined about his arrival in the world. He came fast and efficiently at the end of a cold afternoon, and when Clara Holt put him in Alice's arms and Alice looked at him, she thought, You look like your father around the eyes," which proved as he grew to be exactly true. "James," Alice said before Aaron asked. "James Margaret Donovan." She looked at Aaron. "Yes, I know. But Aunt Margaret put the second bead on the crib herself, and if we don't name someone after her, she'll never forgive me." Aaron smiled. "James it is," he said, "and his middle name can be our secret for a while. Everyone will know within a week when she tells the whole of Cincinnati in a letter." They were right. Aunt Margaret's letter of joy upon receiving the news arrived within 6 weeks and was 5 pages. James grew to be quieter than his brother in temperament, observant where Henry was bold, careful where Henry was impulsive, and the two of them together made a combination that kept Alice and Aaron in a constant state of divided attention and unified joy. Henry taught James to walk by the simple method of luring him across the kitchen floor with a horse figurine Tamaz had carved. And James, when he learned to talk, proved to be remarkably precise with language for someone so small, saying things with such careful accuracy that Aaron would sometimes look at Alice with a helpless expression of recognition, because James sounded exactly like her. By 1890, the ranch had become something Aaron had not fully dared to imagine when he'd started it. A well-regarded operation known across the territory, with a waiting list for horses that now ran a full year, and a reputation for producing animals with the specific combination of speed and sound temperament that he'd been working toward from the beginning. Alice's business management was cited by every buyer who worked with them as one of the clearest and most professional they had encountered, and 2 of the larger ranches in the region had formally contracted with her for quarterly accounts review. She had built something. She had done it while building everything else simultaneously, and she allowed herself to know it fully and without apology. There was a morning in the spring of 1890 when she was sitting at her desk with the morning light coming in her east-facing window, the mountains still pale and cold but the sky brightening above them, and Henry was in the yard with Tamaz learning to lead a young horse, and she could hear James in the kitchen chattering with Aaron about something, the low response of Aaron's voice mixing with James's quicker high one, and she put down her pen and just listened. The texture of everything she had almost missed. The sounds of a life she had almost continued past. She thought about the stage, the wheel coming off 4 miles outside of Harlow Creek, how easily it could have been fixed and continued south, how she could have been in El Paso right now, working for strangers, still running, still carrying that stone of Gerald Forsythe's words in her pocket, still telling herself she was only passing through every place she went because to admit anything else would have required believing she deserved somewhere to stay. She deserved somewhere to stay. She had always deserved it. She had just needed, in the end, for a man to set a plate for her long enough that she could remember it. The autumn of 1890 brought a letter from Kansas City that she had not expected. It was from the judge who had dismissed the warrant, Judge Edmund Farrell, and it informed her that Gerald Forsythe had been investigated by a federal auditor over the summer for ongoing financial irregularities in his business accounts, and that in the course of this investigation, it had come to light that he had a pattern of lodging false accusations against former employees, 3 in total, of whom Alice had been the most recent. The report, now made public, included a formal acknowledgement that the warrant against Alice Margaret Townsend had been based on fabricated evidence provided by Forsythe, and that the record was to be permanently expunged. She held the letter for a long time. Then she went to find Aaron. He was in the barn, checking the bay horse's knee, the original bay, their first horse, still on the property and still occasionally problematic in the way of horses who are very smart and very bored. She handed him the letter without speaking. He read it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he folded it carefully and handed it back to her. "How does it feel?" he asked. She thought about it honestly. "Like something that was supposed to matter more than it does," she said. "It matters. I wanted this. The truth being on record matters." She paused. "But it doesn't change what I know about myself now. I already knew the truth." He looked at her steadily. "You do know it." "I do," she said. He didn't take it from me permanently. He just moved it somewhere I couldn't reach for a while." Aaron put his hand against the side of her face in the way he had the first evening in the corral all those years ago. "You reached it yourself," he said. "I didn't give it back to you." "No," she agreed. "You just set the plate," he smiled. "You did the sitting down." She leaned into him and he held her there in the barn with the horse watching them patiently over his shoulder, and she thought, "I am done running. I have been done for a long time. But this letter is the last thread, and now it is tied off, and the past is finished, and what is here is now entirely the present and the future." She wrote back to Judge Farrell with a brief, dignified acknowledgement of the letter and her gratitude for the record being corrected. She did not write to Forsyth. She had nothing to say to him and nothing she needed from him. Some doors, once closed, need no further attention. She filed the letter in her office, in a folder marked closed, which was where it belonged. The 90s unfolded with the particular, beautiful quality of a life that has found its center and continues to grow from it. Henry started school in Harlow Creek, riding in with the Kessler children on mornings when the weather was good and going in the buckboard when it was not, and showed a terrifying aptitude for mathematics that made Alice's heart swell with something she was not sure had a precise name. James followed him to school 2 years later and showed an equal aptitude for reading and a deep and genuine interest in how things grew, how plants came up from seeds, how animals developed, the slow biological logic of the living world. "He's going to be a naturalist or a doctor," Aaron said once, watching James crouch in the yard to examine something in the soil with complete absorption. "Or both," Alice said. "Can a person be both?" "James can probably be both," she said. "He's very thorough." Tomás married in 1892. A woman named Lucia from the Pueblo community to the north, small and fierce and brilliant with fiber arts, and she and Alice got on immediately in the way of two people who both have strong opinions and respect each other's immediately. Lucia's presence at the ranch changed the social geometry of the place in ways that were entirely welcome, and their daughter, born the following spring, became the default recipient of all the attention that Alice and Aaron could not manage when Henry and James were consuming all of it. The horse operation at this point was sufficiently well established that Aaron could afford to be selective. He had stopped taking any client who came to him, and was instead choosing the partnerships carefully, keeping the operation at a size that allowed quality without overwhelming the capacity of the team. It was Alice's recommendation and Aaron's judgment working in concert, which was how most of their best decisions happened. In the spring of 1893, they took on a young apprentice, a 17-year-old named Cyrus Holt, Clara's youngest, who had shown an exceptional feel for horses since childhood and who wanted nothing more in the world than to learn what Aaron Donovan did. Aaron was a patient and exacting teacher, which Cyrus both dreaded and was grateful for, and within 2 years had a young man who could handle the most difficult training work with confidence. Alice watched Aaron with Cyrus and thought about patience, about the particular patience he had shown her in those first weeks, setting a plate and asking nothing, creating space without filling it with demand. He applied the same quality to teaching. "You could not push knowledge into someone," he said once. "You could only create the conditions for it and be there when it arrived." She had tried to apply that principle to her own sons, with varying success. Henry preferred to figure things out by doing them at full speed and was not always receptive to the creating of conditions. James absorbed things more slowly but more completely, which meant that by the time he knew something, he really knew it. She loved them so specifically, the two of them. Loved Henry's furious enthusiasm and James's quiet depth, and the way they were each entirely themselves, and unlike each other and both, unmistakably, composed of parts of her and parts of Aaron in endlessly interesting combinations. 1895 arrived and Henry was 10 years old and James was 7, and they were, between them, the most engaging human beings Alice had ever spent time with, which she was aware was not an objective assessment but was nevertheless how she felt. She was 38 years old. She felt strong and satisfied and occupied, in the way of a person whose life has filled up with the right things. The ranch was her home in every bone of her body now. The mountains to the east were hers in the way that landscape becomes yours when you have looked at it through enough seasons. She had watched them under snow, under heat, under rain, under the sharp autumn light and the luminous spring light in the heavy blue summer sky, and she knew them. She knew this land. She knew this man. She knew her sons and her work and her neighbors and the horses that came through and the stars at night, which were still and always astonishing above the desert. She knew who she was here, in the most fundamental sense, not just the competent person she had slowly reconstructed after Forsyth, but the full person she had grown into since, the woman who was both more serious and more capable of joy than she had ever been in her youth. There was an evening in October of 1895, one of those evenings that is so complete in itself it becomes a permanent possession. The boys were inside, Henry apparently explaining some elaborate game theory to James, who was listening with his characteristic patience. Tamaz and Lucia and their daughter had gone home for the evening. The horses were settled. Cyrus had gone to his own house. Alice and Aaron sat on the porch of the house as the sun went down behind the western mesa, and the mountains turned copper and rose in the last light, and they did not talk much. There was no need to. The silence between them had been comfortable for years now, not the absence of things to say, but the fullness of people who have said enough things well enough that the quiet is itself a form of conversation. He reached over and took her hand, the way he had 1,000 times, and she interlaced her fingers with his, the way she had 1,000 times, and they watched the light change. "Alice," he said. Are you happy?" She looked at him. He was asking genuinely, not because he was uncertain, but because he thought it was worth asking out loud sometimes, worth making sure the thing you believed was true, was still being tended. "Yes," she said. "Are you?" "More than I thought I was allowed to be," he said. "More than I thought I'd be again." She squeezed his hand. The mountains were burning with the last light. Henry's voice drifted through the window, rising with enthusiasm, and James said something precise and calm that made Henry pause and then apparently concede the point. "More than I thought I was allowed to be," she said. "Yes, that is exactly it." She leaned her head against his shoulder and he rested his cheek against her hair, and they sat there in the cooling evening air while the stars began to appear. One by one, the way they always did out here, first the brightest ones, then more, until the sky was so thick with light it looked solid, looked permanent, looked like something built to last. She thought about the plate one more time. Not with the fear she had felt then, but with the gratitude that had replaced it so completely, she sometimes forgot the fear had existed. The dark past that had sent her running. The hidden motive she had feared to find in every person who was kind to her. The trap she had expected every time a door opened. The forced choice she had thought was her only option, keep moving or get hurt again. The plate. The seventh plate, set in faith, in patient love, in the utterly certain, entirely undemanding, completely honest belief that she would come. She had come. She had sat down. She had stayed. The night settled in around the porch and the stars blazed overhead, and in the house behind them 2 boys argued cheerfully about the rules of a game neither of them had made up, and the horses shifted quietly in their sleep in the barn, and Alice Donovan, who had once told a man she was only passing through, closed her eyes and breathed in the cold October air of the place she had always been going to, whether she knew it or not. She was home. The years that followed were quiet in the best way, not quiet like absence, but quiet like the deep, sustaining note under a full piece of music. Henry grew tall and fierce-minded, and won a scholarship to study mathematics and engineering in Albuquerque in 1903, which made Alice cry at the station for reasons she was entirely at peace with. She was proud, and she missed him before he was even on the train, and both of those things were fine. James became what Aaron had predicted, a naturalist, and then, after correspondence with a doctor in Santa Fe who recognized in his letters the mind of someone who should have formal medical training, a doctor. He practiced in Harlow Creek for a time after his training, which meant he was close, which Alice did not take for granted. Tomaz and Lucia remained. The ranch remained. Aaron's hair went gray at the temples by the early 1900s, and she told him it suited him, which was the truth. And he told her she had more laugh lines than when he'd met her, which she also knew. And she told him she had earned every one of them, which she had. They had one more child, a surprise arrival in 1897, a daughter, Rosa, who came into the world with Alice's coloring and Aaron's steadiness, and a particular combination of her brother's qualities that made her both analytical and deeply sensitive, a combination that would serve her well. Henry, at 12, was by turns fascinated and deeply skeptical of his new sister's presence in the household. James, at 9, took her seriously from the start, which set the tone. Rosa grew up with horses the way her brothers had, with numbers the way her mother had, with the land the way her father had, and she became, in time, her own person in the full and irreducible sense, someone who contained her parents without being defined by them. There was a morning, late in 1905, when Alice was 50 years old, and standing at the window of her office looking at the mountains, which were brilliant with early snow against a clear blue sky. She had been working on the quarterly accounts. The ranch was in its third decade now, still running, still producing exceptional horses, Cyrus Holt long since a full partner in the operation, and she had paused to look at the mountains the way she always did when she needed to reset her mind. She heard Aaron come in behind her. He stood in the doorway of her office, the office he had built her with its east-facing window, and she could feel him looking at her. "You're looking at the mountains," he said. "I always look at the mountains." "I know," he said. "I like watching you look at them." She turned to face him. He was 55 now, and the gray was not just at the temples anymore but throughout, and his face had the kind of weathered beauty that comes from decades of outdoor work and emotional honesty, and she thought, for what was certainly the 1,000th time, that she was looking at the person she knew best in the world. "Come here," she said. He crossed the room and stood beside her at the window and looked at the mountains with her, and she took his hand, and they stood together in the quiet office in the morning light with the accountings of their shared life all around them on the shelves, and the mountains stood ancient and certain to the east, and Alice Donovan, who had once been only passing through, was not passing through anything anymore. She was here. She had been here for 22 years. She would be here until the mountains ceased to burn copper and rose in the evening light, which was to say she would be here always. "I love you," she said, not as something that needed saying but as something that was worth saying again, because it was true today the same way it had been true at the beginning, and saying it kept it alive, kept it from being taken for granted, which was perhaps the most important work of a long love. "I love you," he said, the same way. The mountains were brilliant in the morning light. The snow on their peaks was the clean white of a new page. The horses moved in the corrals below, their breath making small clouds in the cold air, and somewhere in the house Rosa was beginning her day with the particular focused energy that was entirely her own. And in Harlow Creek James was making his rounds as a doctor, and Henry was in Albuquerque doing work that Alice did not entirely understand but read about carefully in the letters he sent, which were detailed and warm and occasionally very funny. This was the life. Not the dramatic center of it, not the highest peak or the deepest crisis, but the daily, accumulated, irreplaceable texture of it. The way each morning led to the next, and the love in each one reinforced the love in the one before, until it was structural, load-bearing, the thing the whole construction rested on. She had been only passing through. He had said that was fine and kept setting an extra plate. And she had sat down and stayed and built something that was hers and his and theirs together. And it was true and real and good, and it was enough, and it was everything. And in the kitchen of the house on the ranch 3 miles east of Harlow Creek, New Mexico territory, where the mountains went copper in the evening, and the stars were thick as possibility in the sky overhead. The table was set for two, as it was every morning, as it would be every morning to come, and that was the truest thing in the world.